Who was Darwin's God? If you go through his writings, that means his publications, his journals, and his letters, you may arrive to the conclusion that Darwin was an agnostic, someone who had some vague sense of spirituality but that would not fit to the Christian dogma. But if you go through the person who has shaped his destiny, you may arrive to a rather different picture of Darwin's spirituality. My name is Maxim. I'm a clinical psychologist, so forgive me if I see psychology everywhere. Modern psychology taught us that the very image we have of the deity is very deeply shaped by the relationship we have developed with people around us, and especially the early figures and the parental figures. On February the 12th, 1809, Susanna Darwin, gave birth to the little Charles, which is her fifth sibling. And Charles has a fragile health. Susanna, who has been described as a very affectionate and very supportive woman, takes very good care of him and has created probably a good sense of emotional stability, but unfortunately, Susanna died when Charles is just 8. And this have probably created a very strong impression on Darwin. And we may say that the rest of his life was about seeking a maternal figure. Darwin's father, Robert Darwin, was a prominent physician. He was famous, he was also a businessman and a member of naturalistic societies. And Charles wanted to please him, so he decided to join in Edinburgh the Faculty of Medicine to be trained as a physician. Unfortunately, he found himself disgusted by the dissection, and above all, he found the medical science extremely boring. So after 2 years, as he wasn't going anywhere, his father decided that if he couldn't be a physician, someone who heals the body, he may become a pastor, someone who heals the soul. So he got him enrolled in Cambridge, in Trinity College, in theology. But unfortunately, Darwin felt disinterest for theology, and above all the teaching given by the Christian theology seemed to clash with the growing knowledge he had about natural sciences. So instead of studying theology, he started to move towards natural sciences. John Henslow was a professor of botanics in Cambridge, and he recognized there was something about Darwin. He encouraged him to take part of several minor scientific expeditions, and he did what his father couldn't do. He believed in Darwin. Thomas Malthus was a sociologist of the end of the 18th century, and as he was the witness of the British early industrialization, he discovered that there were a growing number of peasants moving to the cities to get exploited and to live miserably in the cities. More and more people clustering there. So he started to crunch number, and according to his analysis, the capacity of the nation to produce food was growing in a manner that at one point the ever-growing urban population will make the food situation into a full crisis. So in other words, there won't be enough food for everyone. And Malthus was also a Protestant pastor, and he was very concerned about charity. But instead of recommending the charity, according to Malthus, the best one can do for the poor is to let them die as soon as possible. And this idea, even if it's kind of monstrous, it has really impressed Darwin. We need now to talk about 19th century culture and two very essential aspects. First of all, the natural science at the time of Darwin. So the natural science had made three very important discoveries. The first of all, which dates back from the 17th century, is that through the invention of microscopes, they have discovered that every living beings, being vegetal or animals, were constituted of the very same bricks we call cells. The second discovery, it was due to the efforts of the 18th century to classify species not in a random manner but using scientific methods. But at the beginning of the 19th century, the coolest domain of investigation was fossils, because they recently discovered the fossils of dinosaurs, and there were a huge debate to know what happened to those species that has disappeared. And the dominant narrative to explain that was called, well, we called it later, the creationism. Basically, the idea that God has created all the species and some of them has disappeared. The second aspect of the 19th century culture that need to be understood is the British imperialism. So the 19th century was really the century of Britain. They had a military control of 1/3 of the globe. Due to the very powerful industry, they have control of most of the economical flux, and intellectually, due to the power of science, they had control over thoughts and ideas. And if you want to control the world, you need to have very precise and accurate maps. This is how the Royal Navy decided, amongst its many activities, to establish a proper mapping of South America. And it was as such a more scientific expedition, but obviously their goal was probably to see how to fetch the resources available there. So the Royal Navy has decided to appoint that expedition on a very light and maneuverable ship, the Beagle. And they appointed a very experienced sailor, Captain Robert Fitzroy. But Fitzroy was not only experienced in sailing and in cartography, he was also a naturalist and a fervent Christian. So the idea of Fitzroy was that if he could gather enough samples of fossils and animals and plants, he may gather materials to demonstrate the theory of creationism. But as he was already very busy with being a captain and being the main cartographer of the expedition, he needed someone. That's how he went to his friend John Henslow, who recommended him a rookie, someone who had little experience in science. He had no name, he was just no one, And he was just good enough to take the samples, and he was a fervent naturalist. So it may have be a good fit. And that naturalist was Charles Darwin. So there is a very strong irony that Fitzroy, who decided by his own to add a naturalist to his team in order to demonstrate the creationism, just shot himself a bullet in the feet. On December the 27th, 1831, the Beagle is leaving Britain for a trip that was supposed to last 2 years and that was supposed to be focused just in cartography. But the entire trip was extended to 5 years, and it adds new destination on the Pacific Ocean in Australia, New Zealand, Tahiti, and went all around the world, coming back to South Africa. So we may say that Robert Fitzroy was not exactly on a hurry to come back to Britain. On September the 15th, 1835, the Beagle is landing in an archipelago called the Galapagos. And there something very special happened to Darwin. He got pregnant of the theory of the evolution. And it took him 23 years after that moment to release his very famous book, The Origin of the Species, but that is the place where all the elements settle down in his mind. Why the Galapagos? For two reasons. Being very far away from the mainland, the Galapagos have grown a very specific type of fauna and flora, and you will find there animals that only exist there, like the sea iguana, for instance. But more interestingly, the Galapagos is made of 7 islands, and every single islands have different, slightly different types of animals. And what Darwin discovered, that all those tiny differences of shape of the animals has been caused by the very specific type of environment, and every island has a different type of environment, and this has shaped the way the animal looks. That experience has been for Darwin the most important moment of his life, and we will come back later to discuss what's happened to him personally at this moment. A little bit more than 1 year after the Galapagos, the Beagle came back to Britain. Darwin was already someone in the world of naturalists because he has made some publication. So he had some notoriety. He got married with his first degree cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and together they had 10 children. Emma must have had a very important role in Darwin's life. First of all, because she was, well, his wife. She was providing him with economical means and affective support, and that allowed Darwin to process all the data he had to process and to establish his theory, the basis of his theory, in a very strong manner. But Darwin was scared to go overt about his publication. In 1858, Russell Wallace, who was a naturalist a bit younger than Darwin, who was in his own expedition in Indonesia, arrived exactly to the same conclusion of Darwin's theory. And somehow he knew his idea, so he sent him a letter to expose his idea. And Darwin decided to publish a first paper with the theory of the two gentlemen, presented in what they had in common and the small differences. And this gave to Darwin the guts to publish his major opus 1 year later, 1859, The Origin of the Species. And without that, Russell Wallace, this theory may have remained a personal and private theory, and the world would be a different place. No one will dispute that Darwin has an immense influence on the mentality of the 20th and 21st century people. And at first, that theory was vehemently rejected by the religious authority because it was just unacceptable. But through time, nowadays, most of the Christians not only accept the theory of evolution, but they even embrace it, because if God has created a world which is so wonderful that it has its own way to evolve, that means that the Creator is still a more interesting being. So at the spiritual level, it only shocks a few people who may consider that it is a dangerous theory. So if we see how the theory of evolution has shaped our sense of being a human, it is really massive. First of all, before Darwin, people had the feeling that the world was relatively new and the human species was completely different. And what Darwin taught us, that we are part of a very long process of natural history. We have emerged when inorganic matter create organic matter, create the first cell, create the first pluricellular, created the first vertebrate, then the first mammals, and we are at the end of that very long chain. But in the growth of the human embryo, all those stages are repeated. So it is really all that history is part of what we are. That's extremely important. And another fundamental aspect is that as species evolved, and they may appear at one moment, they also extinguish. So we humans, as every other living species, we are endangered animals. But we haven't answered so far that very important question about what was Darwin's God. And we need to go one step further than just saying that he was an agnostic. It is entirely possible that the experience that has shaped Darwin's mind was not only a scientific encounter of the intellectual concept of the evolution of the species. It is possible that in the Galapagos something much deeper happened privately to Darwin. He have encountered what is referred to as the divine goddess. Some call it Mother Nature, which is a bit a cheesy name. But in most of the world's religion, there is a reference to that figure, and in the Greek mythology, she was called Gaia. And in my views, in the Galapagos, Darwin met the Divine Mother, and she taught him the theory of evolution in order to bring to mankind that knowledge, that part of what we are is embedded in the Earth history, to reconcile ourselves to Earth, Because before that, people were thinking that we just have been thrown into the world by a God that has created us from clay, but we were not really part of the creation. And if we embrace the vision of the mother, we are part of creation. We are part of earth.